We're here at the Natchaug River USGS gauging station with John Morrison. John, why don't you tell us about yourself and your agency?
My name's John Morrison. I'm a supervisory hydrologic technician with the United States Geological Survey Water Resources Center in the New England area.
So John, there are 4 stream gauges in the Natchaug watershed. Where are they? What do they measure? And how is this data used?
So we do have 4 stream gauges in the Natchaug watershed. There's one near the confluence of the Natchaug River that's down in the Willimantic area. And that is the longest operating gauge. That gauge has been there since 1930. The gauge we're at here is another gauge on the Natchaug River. This gauge was installed in 2006. There's also stream gauges on the Fenton River and one on the Mount Hope River. And these gauges are used to provide information to resource managers on what the flow conditions are in the river and provide long-term statistical record on stream flow. They also are used for prediction of flooding. This stream gauge here was installed to provide information on the inflow to Mansfield Hollow, so that the managers that use the information down there can understand how much water is coming into the reservoir. Prior to this, they only had the Mount Hope River, and so this gauge, being much bigger, it has a 66 square mile drainage area, provided them much more input on how much water was coming down. And they needed this information after the flood in 2005. So the 4 stream gauges do provide information on long-term records of stream flow. We also have a water quality monitoring program along the Natchaug River, and that's at a site just downstream from here as well.
Great. So the longest serving stream gauge is the one in Willimantic. What was the highest flood stage that was reported?
So that flood stage down there was right around 32,000 cubic feet per second.
Wow.
And that is an enormous volume of water. And the flood of 1955 was a big flood, but that was the flood of period of record for that gauge. The 1938 flood was even bigger, but the gauge was not installed at that time. So the Natchaug River had a much higher flow than the flood of 1938.
We're in the middle of a severe drought. Is the water level ever too low to monitor?
It can get pretty low. Our stream gauging equipment is installed so that it can be as low as possible so that we don't go out of water, but occasionally we don't see all of the times that it's going to get as low as this. So this station here right now today is flowing at right around 3 cubic feet per second. The lowest flow we've ever recorded here is about 2.5 cubic feet per second. And we can go a little bit lower than that. It will monitor down almost to about 1 cubic foot per second. But at that point, the flow is so low that the sensing equipment is no longer submerged because it's a fairly uneven channel. We do have what's called operational limits, and those are available on our website, at the USGS website. And so you can see what the lowest operational range of a gauge is, as well as the highest operational range for a gauge too, which is important during flooding conditions. We saw that in Hurricane Harvey in places in Texas, where the water level came up to the highest operational level of the gauge, and then the gauge went underwater. So people knew that the stage that was reported was the water was much higher than that now because the gauge actually was submerged due to the flood.
Wow. So 3 cubic feet per second versus, what did you say was the highest?
The highest flow here was 5,400 CFS.
That's a significant difference.
And that was in 2011.
So there's got to be annual maintenance you have to do on these gauges to make sure they're calibrated correctly?
Yes, we come out to these gauges usually about 8 times a year, and we make sure that all the stage sensing equipment is operating. What the gauge really records is the stream stage, so it measures the height of the river. And then on those periodic visits that we come out, we actually measure the flow. And that relationship between the height of the river and how much water is flowing by is called the rating curve. And so we maintain that rating curve throughout the year and year to year, because the channel does shift and that relationship changes through time. And so those visits occur about 8 times a year, more if we have wet years and we're out here for catching floods.
In 2011, Connecticut passed stream flow regulations. These gauges have to be pretty important to make sure those stream flows are being maintained?
Yes. Stations like this one, in an unregulated watershed, there's no regulation above this part of the watershed, provide really important information on what the natural stream flow conditions are in the state. They allow us to use these gauges as indexes of what the flow should be in other locations around. So some of the regulated watersheds have to use gauges like this one as an index to know how much water is going by if they're ungauged. So these gauges are really important on water bodies that are unregulated. There's no dams, there's no hydrologic regulation, there's no power plants or anything releasing water upstream on this. So this is a pristine watershed with natural flow conditions here.
Well, we call it a healthy watershed for the project we're working on because it is mostly undeveloped and least impacted. Is this data available for anybody to look at?
Yes, all of our data is publicly available. It's available at the USGS webpage. If you go to the USGS New England Water Science Center webpage, you'll find links to the data for all of the stream gauges that we operate in Connecticut as well as throughout New England. We provide what the real-time flow is on a day-to-day basis. We also have information on precipitation, air temperature, and water temperature at this location. And we have historical context for that information as well. So you can look at what the flow is today relative to other days or other years, wet years and dry years. So you can get an understanding of how today fits into the hydrologic cycle of other years past.
Sounds like a lot involved in keeping these stream gauges managed and calibrated. Do you have funding challenges to keep these things operating?
Yes, we do. We always have funding challenges. The network as a whole relies on multiple different sources of funding to keep things operating. Some gauges are funded by cooperative agreements between the USGS and the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. Some are funded through cooperative relationships with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Some are funded through arrangements with towns and municipalities. Some are funded through arrangements with water suppliers and water companies. And so managing the network as a whole is a challenge. Sometimes some of our cooperating agencies will have funding challenges and they'll pull back their funding for a specific gauge, and then we have to look for other sources of funding. Gauges like this one, where it's a natural condition, there's no permit set to run this gauge, this can be a challenge to keep gauges like this one funded. It's had funding challenges through time. It's been discontinued, it's had funding discontinuation a number of times, and we've sought other sources of funding to keep it running.
So John, what is the role of the New England Water Science Center?
The role of the New England Water Science Center is to serve the public by providing high-quality hydrologic and scientific information for areas in New England as well as across the United States. These include stream flow, groundwater levels, and water quality data, as well as information on flood inundation, flood frequency, long-term changes in climate and hydrologic trends in water quality, conditions, and constituent loads, groundwater flow, contaminant transport, as well as other regional hydrologic studies that advance the science of hydrologic research across the United States. Ultimately, our goal is to provide resource managers and the general public with the scientific information they need to help inform their management and day-to-day and long-term decisions.
It's a very important role, and we're thankful for you to be there fulfilling it for us.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to talk to you guys today.